The planet Clovax Prime was the center of a brutal sport that spanned the galaxy. The Xalcor, a fierce and powerful species, ruled this arena, making deadly games their favorite form of entertainment. The most famous of their creations was the Marvok, a massive, terrifying beast with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian and claws sharp enough to cut through starship hulls. The Marvok had been bred for battle, designed to fight and win in every arena across the galaxy. But today, it lay defeated on the cold metal floors of an asteroid prison, abandoned by the very beings who had once worshipped it. The Xalcor had no need for losers. The Marvok had failed. And now, it was a broken shell of the monster it once was. The creature's once glowing red eyes flickered weakly, barely registering the cold, sterile walls around it. Its body was covered in gashes, some deep enough to expose the muscle beneath, and the scared skin had begun to harden in the chill of the asteroid's atmosphere. The pain was constant, a reminder that it had failed its creators. The Xalcor had left it to die alone. On the bridge of the human ship Eureka, Captain Elena Hart stared at the readouts from her ship's scanners, her face set in a look of determined focus. Her crew had picked up a distress signal, faint but there. A garbled transmission, almost lost among the thousands of other signals drifting in the black void of space. She didn't know who, or what, had sent it, but her instincts told her that it was something important. "Captain, you'll want to see this," Lieutenant Clara Moore called from across the room, her voice full of uncertainty. "The signal's coming from a location near Clovax Prime, but it's not a standard distress call. It's something else." Elena stood up from her chair, walking over to Clara's console. The screen displayed a map of the area, with the signal pinpointed on a lonely asteroid in the dark expanse. It was a dead rock, barely large enough to hold a mining colony, much less a fleet of ships. But the signal was too clear to ignore. "It's coming from there," Elena said, squinting at the map. "What are the Xalcor doing with a distress beacon?" "I don't know, but the signal's damaged. It's weak. Probably a distress call from someone in trouble," Clara answered. Elena chewed on her lip for a moment. The Xalcor were dangerous and unpredictable, but there was something about this situation that felt off. "Plot a course. Let's find out who needs help." The Eureka moved swiftly toward the asteroid, its engines humming as the ship powered through space. As they neared the source of the signal, the crew began to feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on them. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, but she had no way of knowing if that was true. All she knew was that something, or someone, was out there, calling for help. The asteroid came into view, a jagged lump of rock surrounded by debris. There was no sign of life, no movement on the surface, yet the distress signal was still there, pulsing weakly through the blackness. Elena ordered the crew to prepare for a search. She needed answers. They couldn't just leave. As the Eureka descended, Elena's heart raced. It was impossible to ignore the massive structure anchored to the surface of the asteroid. It was an old Xalcor facility, worn and broken but still standing tall. They had found the source of the signal. "Captain, we've detected life signs," Clara reported, her voice trembling slightly. "They're weak, but definitely alive." "Where?" Elena asked. "It's inside the structure. Hold on, I'm locking on a signal now," Clara said. After a tense pause, she added, It's coming from inside the main containment chamber." "Containment?" Elena frowned. That didn't sound good, but they had no choice but to investigate. She signaled the crew to suit up and prepare for entry. As they entered the facility, they were greeted by the sight of a massive, hulking figure chained to the walls of a containment cell. The creature was covered in blood and dirt, its body bruised and battered from an apparent battle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, a terrifying shade of red. The Marvok. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she studied the creature. It was clear that this was no ordinary animal. The Marvok was an apex predator, a creature designed for war, and it had been left to die. "Is it alive?" Clara asked, her voice filled with disbelief. For a moment, the Marvok's eyes locked onto Alina's. It let out a low, guttural growl, a warning. Despite its condition, there was a fire in those eyes. But Alina wasn't scared. She couldn't explain why. But she knew one thing for sure. This creature, this alien, was not their enemy. It had been betrayed by its creators, and now it was up to humanity to decide what happened next. The Marvok, chained and bleeding in its dark prison, growled low, sending a ripple of tension through the crew. Alina stood frozen for a moment, staring into the beast's fiery eyes. Despite its obvious injuries and broken spirit, there was still an undeniable strength in its presence. The creature was dangerous. Of that, Alina was certain. But it was not the cold, mindless monster that Xalcor had used it to be. There was something more. A living being that had been cast aside. "Captain, what do we do?" Lieutenant Clara Moore asked, her voice tight with apprehension. The rest of the crew had begun to look uneasy as well. The Marvok's size and power were intimidating, and every instinct screamed at them to leave the creature behind. But Alina couldn't do that. Not after seeing the way it looked at them, broken, abandoned, and in pain. "We help it," Alina said firmly, stepping closer to the containment cell. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. They had only just arrived, and already they were making decisions that could risk their lives. But Alina's mind was made up. We're not leaving without it. The ship's engineers worked quickly to disable the containment field, which hummed with electricity, a barrier designed to keep even the fiercest creatures trapped. Alina's heart raced as she watched the Marvok closely, every muscle in her body ready for action. The creature's eyes followed her every movement, its growl becoming a low rumble in its chest. It was clear the Marvok was not entirely sure whether to trust the humans. As the field flickered off with a sharp crackle, Alina's team began to move cautiously forward. The Marvok stood up, a massive figure, its body towering over the humans as it stretched its limbs with painful slowness. Despite the wounds, it still exuded an intimidating aura of power. "Easy," Alina said, her voice soft but steady. "We're not here to hurt you." The Marvok's red eyes flashed with suspicion. It snarled, and its sharp claws scraped the ground, leaving deep marks in the metal. But Alina didn't back away. She kept her gaze steady and calm, trying to communicate with the creature in the only way she could, through trust. Dr. Owen Vargas, the ship's chief medical officer, was the first to step forward, holding up a medpack cautiously. "We can help with your wounds," he said, his tone gentle but serious. "Let us treat you." The creature's gaze shifted to the human doctor, its eyes narrowing with doubt. It took a step back, growling louder. Alina motioned for Dr. Vargas to stop, sensing the creature's fear. "Not now," Alina whispered. She turned to her crew. "Step back. Let me handle this." She slowly lowered herself to one knee, trying to make herself seem less threatening. "I know you're in pain," Alina said, her voice quiet but clear. "We're not like the Xalcor. We won't hurt you." For a long moment, the only sound was the rasping breath of the Marvok. Then, finally, it let out a low, defeated growl and slumped slightly. It was not a sign of surrender, but of exhaustion. The creature was too weak to fight back, and it seemed to know that. Alina slowly stood up, careful not to make any sudden moves. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "We'll get you out of here. We'll help you." The Marvok's eyes followed her movements, its distrust still apparent, but there was something else in its gaze now: curiosity. It seemed to understand that the humans were not like the ones that had betrayed it. It was a strange, fragile moment. For the first time, Alina could see the creature as more than just a weapon, more than a beast. It was a sentient being, trapped in a nightmare it didn't choose. "Captain, the ship's ready to leave," said Clara, her voice shaking a little from the tension in the air. "But we need to be quick. There's no telling how long the Xalcor will wait before they notice the prison's been breached." Alina nodded sharply, her mind racing. They didn't have much time. Dr. Vargas, get your team ready. We're bringing it with us. It was an idea that made the rest of the crew uneasy, but there was no turning back now. The Marvok needed help, and Elena was determined to give it. With Dr. Vargas leading the way, the crew began to carefully help the Marvok out of the containment cell. The creature's steps were slow and unsteady, its body clearly battered from whatever battle it had been forced into. But there was a flicker of strength in its movements, a will to survive that could not be ignored. As they reached the airlock, Elena paused, glancing at the creature one last time before entering the ship. The Marvok, still watching them warily, hesitated in the doorway. "Come on," Elena said softly. "We're leaving this hell behind. You don't have to stay here." Finally, with a heavy sigh, the Marvok stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the Eureka and leaving the prison behind. The moment the airlock sealed and the ship's engines roared to life, Elena allowed herself to exhale in relief. But her job was far from over. They had saved the creature, but what came next would be even harder. They didn't know who or what would come after them. The Salcor wouldn't let the Marvok go easily. But for now, they had one thing, the creature's life. And Elena was going to make sure they kept it. The journey back to the Eureka's hidden base, Haven 7, was a quiet one. The crew was tense, each person lost in their thoughts. They had rescued the Marvok, but no one knew exactly what to expect next. Was it a danger to them, or was it just a broken creature that needed help? Captain Elena Hart sat in her quarters, looking out at the stars through the small window. The ship's lights flickered gently in the background. Her mind was still on the Marvok, Tarkus as she had decided to call it. The creature had been severely injured, both physically and emotionally. It was clear that Tarkus had seen too much violence in its life, and the scars weren't just on its body. There was a deep pain in its eyes, something no one on her crew had expected. "Captain." Clara Moore's voice came through the intercom. Elena's hand hovered over the panel. "We've finished the scans. Dr. Vargas wants to see you in the medical bay. It's about the Marvok." Elena stood up, her heart beating a little faster. She had been hoping for good news, but after seeing Tarkus's condition, she wasn't sure what to expect. She left her quarters and made her way to the medical bay, where Dr. Owen Vargas was already waiting, along with his team of medical officers. "Captain," Dr. Vargas greeted her, his face serious. "We've run all the tests we could. The Marvok is, well, it's complicated." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" "Physically, it's in rough shape. The wounds are deep, and some of them are infected. But that's not the worst of it." Dr. Vargas led her over to the bed where Tarkus lay, still unconscious, wrapped in a tangle of medical equipment and IV lines. The creature's huge body barely fit on the bed. "This Marvok is unlike anything we've ever seen. It's not just a simple animal. It's sentient, Captain." Elena looked down at Tarkus, its massive chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Its wounds were serious, but there was something else there, something that couldn't be fixed with medicine alone. The creature's mind was fractured. The pain, both physical and emotional, had taken a toll on it. "We've done what we can to stabilize its body," Dr. Vargas continued, "but Tarkus isn't responding the way we expect. It's refusing to trust us, to let us help. Every time we get close, its heart rate spikes, and it becomes agitated. I think it's scared of us." Elena nodded, understanding. It had been abandoned by its own creators, tossed aside when it was no longer useful. Now, Tarkus saw the humans as just another group who might hurt it. She didn't blame the creature for being afraid. "I think it needs more than just medicine," Elena said softly. "It needs compassion. It's been used, tortured, and treated like a weapon. We have to show it that we're different." Dr. Vargas didn't look convinced. "Captain, I understand your intentions, but this creature is a beast. It was bred for war. It's killed countless beings. You want to put trust in it." "Yes, Elena replied without hesitation. It was abandoned by everyone else, but not by us. We're going to treat it like we would any other living being. If it's going to heal, it has to trust us. For the next few days, Elena and the crew did everything they could to make Tarkus feel safe. They spoke to it softly, avoided sudden movements, and allowed it to adjust to the new environment at its own pace. Dr. Vargas and his team worked on the physical wounds, cleaning the infections and stitching up deep gashes. But the real challenge was gaining Tarkus's trust. The creature remained mostly silent, refusing to communicate, though its eyes followed the humans closely. It would growl when they came too close, its teeth bared in warning. Elena knew this wasn't aggression, it was fear. And yet, even through its fear, Tarkus showed small signs of understanding. When Elena first sat near it, holding out a hand, Tarkus merely stared at her with suspicion. But the next day, when Elena returned, Tarkus let her get a little closer. The bond, though fragile, was beginning to form. One evening, as Elena sat quietly in the medical bay, Tarkus finally moved. It shifted its enormous head toward her, the red eyes studying her in a way that was almost curious. Elena didn't make any sudden moves. She simply sat, her hand resting gently on the edge of the bed, as if giving the creature the choice to come closer. Tarkus sniffed the air, its large nostrils flaring. Slowly, cautiously, it reached a massive paw toward her. Elena remained still, her breath held in anticipation. The paw hovered just above her hand before it lowered. The weight of the creature's touch was heavy, but it was also careful. Tarkus was testing her, just as she had tested it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," Elena whispered softly, looking into the creature's eyes. There was no growl, no sign of aggression, only the quiet acceptance of its presence. That night, Elena couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had rescued the Marvuk, and more than that, they had saved it from itself. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a living being, one that had suffered and survived. And with the right care, Elena believed Tarkus could heal, not just physically, but emotionally. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still challenges to face, both from the Xal core and from within Tarkus itself. But Elena knew one thing for certain. They had made the right choice. Humanity had saved something that no one else could, or would, and that made all the difference. Days passed on the Eureka, and Tarkus continued to show small signs of improvement. The creature had begun to eat more regularly, and had stopped growling when the humans approached. Elena and the crew made sure to give it space, but they were always nearby, ready to help if needed. Slowly, Tarkus began to trust them, though the process was still delicate. One morning, as Elena was walking through the ship's corridors, Clara Moore approached her with an urgent look on her face. "Captain, we've got a problem," Clara said, her voice strained. "It's a message from the Xal core. They've tracked us." Elena's heart sank. "How?" "They're not saying how they found us, but they're coming. A fleet is on its way to Haven 7. They'll be here in less than a day." Clara's face was pale. "We need to prepare. They won't be merciful if they find us." Elena took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She had known this day would come. The Xal core were ruthless. They would stop at nothing to reclaim the Marvuk, and they wouldn't care that Tarkus had been abandoned. To them, it was a valuable asset, a weapon. Elena could only imagine what they would do if they found it on her ship. "Alert the crew. Get the defenses up. We're not running this time," Elena said, her voice steady but firm. She had already made up her mind. "We'll face them head-on." As she made her way to the command deck, her mind raced. Tarkus was still recovering. The creature had shown no signs of aggression, but there was no way to know how it would react when faced with the Xal core. The last thing Elena wanted was for Tarkus to be used as a weapon again. "We're not letting them take it," she whispered to herself. "We'll protect it." When Elena arrived at the bridge, the situation was already becoming critical. Clara was busy coordinating the crew, making sure the ship's weapons were ready and the shields were at full power. "Captain," Clara said, looking up from her console, "we've got their fleet on sensors. They're coming in fast. They're not sending a message or offering negotiations. They're just coming to destroy us and take Tarkus back." Alina felt a sharp pang of anger in her chest. The Xalcor had no regard for life. They only saw Tarkus as a tool to be used and discarded when no longer needed. Alina wouldn't let them get away with it. "Captain, the Marvuk." "Tarkus," Dr. Vargas said from behind her. Alina turned to face him. "It's still weak. I'm not sure how it will react to seeing the Xalcor again." Alina's gaze softened. "We'll figure it out. We're not giving it up." The tension in the air was palpable as the Eureka prepared for battle. The crew worked together, activating every defense system the ship had, but Alina knew that their technology could only do so much against the Xalcor fleet. The real battle would come when Tarkus was forced to confront its past. As the fleet of Xalcor warships neared, Alina gathered her crew in the command center. "We're going to fight back. We'll hold them off as long as we can," Alina said, her voice steady. "But we have to keep Tarkus safe. I need volunteers to stay with the Marvuk and make sure it doesn't get caught in the crossfire." Dr. Vargas stepped forward, his face determined. "I'll stay with Tarkus. We've made progress with its recovery. It'll be safer with me." Clara raised her hand as well. "I'll stay with them too. Tarkus needs us." Alina nodded. She trusted them. "Thank you. The rest of us will fight to keep them away from the ship. This isn't just about Tarkus. It's about showing the Xalcor that we won't back down." The ship's alarms began to blare as the Xalcor ships dropped out of hyperspace, their massive forms blocking out the stars. The Eureka was outgunned, but Alina didn't care. She would fight to the last. "We're going to need all our firepower," Clara said, her hands flying over the controls. "The Xalcor ships are powerful, but they're not unbeatable. We just need to outmaneuver them." Alina took her seat at the command chair, gripping the armrests tightly. "Get us close to their lead ship. We'll take the fight to them." The Eureka's engines roared to life, and the ship sped toward the Xalcor fleet. The crew braced for impact as the enemy ships opened fire, their weapons lighting up the darkness of space. The shields of the Eureka held for now, but Alina knew they wouldn't last long if the fight dragged on. Back in the medical bay, Tarkus stirred. Its massive form trembled as it slowly rose to its feet, sensing the danger outside. Dr. Vargas and Clara kept their distance, but Tarkus' eyes were wide with fear and confusion. It had been trained to fight, but it had also been abandoned by the ones who had once controlled it. "I'm not leaving you," Clara said softly, her voice gentle as she stepped closer to the creature. "We're in this together." Tarkus growled low, but the fear was more apparent than the aggression. It wasn't ready to fight yet, not until it understood that the humans meant it no harm. But as the Xalcor ships closed in, the time for hiding was over. Tarkus's instincts began to take over, its muscles tensing. Alina's plan had always been to protect the creature, but now she had to ask herself, could Tarkus fight alongside them? Would the Marvuk's strength and power be enough to turn the tide in their favor? The answer, Alina knew, would come soon. The battle had only just begun. The Xalcor fleet moved like a wave of destruction, their massive ships surrounding the Eureka on all sides. Alina gripped the armrests of her command chair, watching as the enemy ships opened fire. The Eureka shuddered under the impact of their weapons, but the shields held strong for now. "Shields are holding at 75%, Captain," Clara Moore reported from the tactical station. "We can take a few more hits, but not many." "Divert all power to the shields," Alina ordered. "We need to buy time for Tarkus." Back in the medical bay, Dr. Vargas and Clara stayed close to Tarkus, watching as the creature shifted nervously. Its muscles tensed and its eyes glowed with an intense red light. Tarkus's breathing quickened as it heard the sound of the explosions outside. "We need to keep it calm," Dr. Vargas said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Tarkus is still weak. If it gets too stressed, it might make things worse. Clara nodded, but she could see the creature's instincts kicking in. Tarkus was a warrior, born to fight. The Xal'Kor had trained it for war. But now, Tarkus was trapped in a position it never asked for, caught between its past as a weapon and its present as a living being. Tarkus let out a low growl, its eyes flashing with a mix of fear and anger. It wanted to fight, but it wasn't ready. "We have to hold it together," Clara said quietly, stepping closer to Tarkus. "We're here for you. We're not leaving you behind." The Marvok's massive body seemed to relax just a little, as if understanding that the humans weren't its enemies. But it was clear that Tarkus's mind was still a battlefield, torn between its old programming and the new reality it was facing. Back on the bridge, Alina barked orders as the ship rocked under another attack. "Return fire. Target their lead ship. We have to cripple their weapons." The Eureka's guns fired back, sending blasts of energy toward the lead Xal'Kor ship. The enemy ship's shields flared, but the blasts managed to leave a small dent in its armor. It was a small victory, but it was something. Alina knew they couldn't win a straight-up fight with the Xal'Kor. Their fleet outnumbered them and outgunned them, but she wasn't going to give up without a fight. "We're taking too much damage," Clara reported again. "We need to get out of here, Captain." Alina gritted her teeth. "Not yet. We have to hold them off long enough for Tarkus to recover. If we can just buy enough time, we'll have a chance." The ship rocked again, this time with a more violent jolt. The lights flickered, and the sound of alarms echoed through the ship. Alina's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. They were running out of time. She had to make a choice. Prepare the escape pods. If things go south, we need a way to evacuate, Alina said, her voice steady. "But we're not giving up the Marvok. We'll fight to the end." As the crew scrambled to prepare for the worst, Tarkus's growl grew louder. The creature was no longer just reacting to the sounds of battle. It was preparing to fight. It pushed against the medical bed, trying to stand despite its weakened state. Dr. Vargas tried to hold it back, but Tarkus was too strong. "Don't," Dr. Vargas said, his voice strained. "You're not ready." But Tarkus's eyes burned with determination. The creature's instincts had taken over. It wasn't just trying to escape. It was ready to fight. The Marvok let out a roar that shook the walls of the ship. "We don't have time," Clara said urgently, looking toward Dr. Vargas. "If Tarkus is ready, we need to move now. We can't wait for the Xal'Kor to break through our defenses." Alina's voice came through the comms, filled with urgency. "Get Tarkus to the hangar bay. We'll need its help." Dr. Vargas and Clara didn't hesitate. Together, they guided Tarkus out of the medical bay and toward the hangar. The creature moved with surprising speed for its size, its powerful limbs carrying it down the ship's corridors. Despite the pain, Tarkus was determined. It knew what it had to do. Alina watched from the bridge, her heart racing as Tarkus made its way to the hangar bay. She knew the creature was still fragile, still recovering. But if Tarkus could fight, it would be their only chance. "We're going to need everything we've got," Alina said, gripping the armrests of her chair as the ship took another hit. "Clara, get us to the Xal'Kor fleet's flank. We need to catch them off guard." Clara nodded, pushing the controls forward. The Eureka swerved hard, dodging incoming fire and heading toward the edge of the enemy formation. The Xal'Kor ships weren't prepared for the sudden change in direction, and the Eureka managed to get a few good shots in, hitting one of the enemy ships hard. "We've got a hole in their line," Clara reported. "We're in. Now or never, Captain." On the hangar deck, Tarkus had arrived. The creature stepped into the fighter bay, its massive body casting a shadow over the smaller human ships. Dr. Vargas and Clara stayed close, watching as Tarkus slowly began to adjust to the environment, its claws scraping the floor as it prepared. "Are you ready?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but filled with hope. Tarkus looked at her, its glowing eyes full of understanding. It wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. It was fighting for something else, something it had lost long ago. Its purpose. "Let's do this," Clara said, and with that, they prepared for the next phase of the battle. The Eureka and Tarkus were ready to face the Xalcor head-on. The Eureka shook as it sped toward the heart of the Xalcor fleet. Outside, the enemy ships were everywhere, massive and menacing, but inside the Eureka, the crew was focused. There was no turning back now. They had committed to this fight, and they would give it everything they had. Elena stood at the command station, her hands gripping the controls. "Clara, get us as close to their flagship as you can. We need to hit their command center. Once we take it down, the rest of their fleet should fall apart." Clara nodded, her hands moving quickly over the console. "I'm on it, Captain." Meanwhile, in the hangar, Tarkus was ready. The Marvok stood tall, its massive body gleaming in the soft lights of the ship. Its eyes were locked on the exit, where the massive hangar doors would soon open, giving it access to the vacuum of space. Tarkus's instincts were fully awake now. Its past as a weapon was pushing it forward, and its newfound bond with the humans was giving it the strength it needed to fight. Clara and Dr. Vargas stood by, watching the creature carefully. It was still not fully healed, its muscles trembling with the effort to stand tall, but Tarkus was determined. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something more. Tarkus was no longer just a tool of war. It was something more than that. It had found a place among these humans, and it would fight to protect them. The loud sound of the hangar doors opening echoed through the ship. The cold vacuum of space greeted them as Tarkus stepped forward, its massive feet clanging against the metal floor. The creature wasn't used to flying, but with its battle instincts, it was ready to adapt. Dr. Vargas took a few steps back, giving Tarkus the space it needed. "Tarkus, we're counting on you," Clara said, her voice steady but full of hope. "You don't have to do this alone. We'll back you up." Tarkus growled softly in response, then turned its eyes toward the open space beyond. It could feel the power of the Xalcor fleet ahead, the hum of their engines and the crackle of their weapons. It was time to act. Back on the bridge, Elena was waiting. The Eureka was getting closer to the Xalcor flagship, and the crew was preparing for the most dangerous part of their mission. The Xalcor ships had begun to close in on them, but Elena wasn't worried. She had something the enemy didn't. "Tarkus, fire at will," Elena ordered as the first Xalcor ship came into range. The Eureka's weapons opened up, sending energy blasts toward the enemy ships. The shields of the Xalcor ships flared as the blasts hit, but the enemy wasn't going down without a fight. Their ships returned fire, sending deadly beams of energy toward the Eureka. "Shields down to 40%, Clara reported, her voice tense. "We need backup, Captain. We can't keep this up forever." Elena's heart raced. She had hoped Tarkus would be ready, but the pressure was on now. If the creature didn't step up, they would lose. The Xalcor were too powerful to take on alone. And then, like a shadow, Tarkus appeared in the distance. It wasn't flying a fighter ship like the humans. It was a weapon unto itself. Tarkus had jumped out into space, leaping toward the Xalcor ships with terrifying speed. The Xalcor fleet didn't see it coming. Tarkus moved with deadly grace, its massive claws slicing through space. As it reached the first enemy ship, Tarkus let out a roar, the sound carrying across the vacuum. The Marvok's claws slashed through the hull of the first ship, sending pieces of metal and debris flying in all directions. The ship's shields flickered, and then, with one mighty strike, Tarkus tore the ship in half. The crew of the Eureka stared in shock and awe as Tarkus tore through the enemy fleet. It was as if the Marvok had become the embodiment of destruction. Tarkus wasn't just fighting. It was taking revenge on the Xalcor for everything they had done to it. It was no longer a victim. It was a force of nature. "Captain," Clara said in a stunned voice, "Tarkus is taking them down, one by one." Elena couldn't help but smile. Tarkus is not just a weapon. It's an ally. Tarkus was moving through the fleet like a storm, its claws cutting through the Salcor ships with ease. The crew watched in awe as the creature battled its former masters, each strike showing the power it had gained from its time with the humans. Back on the bridge, Elena issued orders. Keep up the pressure. The Salcor are retreating. Let's finish this. The battle raged on, but with Tarkus on their side, the tide had begun to turn. The Salcor ships were losing power, their lines breaking as Tarkus made its way through them. One by one, the ships were destroyed. It wasn't just the Eureka's weapons that were doing the damage now. Tarkus was fighting back, tearing apart the Salcor fleet with each passing moment. But as Tarkus closed in on the flagship, a massive new threat emerged. The Salcor had sent their final weapon, their own Marvok. It was bigger, more powerful, and more aggressive than Tarkus had ever been. The two creatures locked eyes, each sensing the other's strength. The battle was about to become personal. Tarkus, Elena shouted over the comms. You can do this. Tarkus let out a roar of defiance, its eyes filled with the fire of battle. It wasn't fighting for survival anymore. It was fighting for its place in the universe, alongside the humans who had accepted it. Tarkus charged toward the Salcor Marvok, ready for the final battle. The Salcor flagship loomed ahead, its massive form cutting through the stars like a dark, unyielding shadow. But this time, the Eureka wasn't alone. Tarkus, the Marvok, was leading the charge, its massive claws flashing in the cold void of space as it moved toward the enemy flagship. Elena stood at the command station, her eyes fixed on the view ahead. The battle had reached its climax. The Salcor fleet was in chaos, with Tarkus tearing through their lines like a wild force of nature. But now, the ultimate test awaited. The Salcor had released their own Marvok, a creature bigger and stronger than Tarkus. This would be the true battle. Tarkus is heading toward the flagship, Clara reported, her voice tight with anticipation. It's going after the Salcor's Marvok. Elena's heart raced. The odds were stacked against them. The Salcor Marvok was bigger, more powerful, and still loyal to its creators. Tarkus, though fierce, had only just begun to understand its own power. Would it be enough? Clara, get us in close, Elena ordered. We need to support Tarkus, but we can't take on the flagship alone. Clara worked quickly, adjusting the ship's trajectory. The Eureka darted toward the edge of the enemy fleet, weaving through explosions and energy blasts. The Salcor ships were in disarray, but the flagship remained a looming threat, its shields strong and its weapons deadly. Back in the heart of the battle, Tarkus faced the Salcor Marvok. The two creatures were locked in an intense standoff, their eyes meeting as if they could sense each other's strength. The Salcor Marvok growled low, its powerful limbs flexing, preparing for the first strike. Tarkus did the same, its own body tense and ready. Without warning, the two creatures collided, the sound of impact echoing through space. Tarkus's claws met the Salcor Marvok's thick armor with a loud crunch. The force of the blow sent both creatures tumbling through space, their bodies twisting and turning as they grappled for dominance. Come on, Tarkus, Clara shouted over the comms. You've got this. On the Eureka, the crew watched anxiously. The fight between the two Marvoks was like a clash of titans. Tarkus fought with raw fury, each strike filled with years of pent-up rage, pain, and frustration. The Salcor Marvok was stronger, but Tarkus wasn't fighting for survival anymore. It was fighting for freedom. Tarkus' claws dug into the Salcor Marvok's side, ripping through its armor. The Salcor creature howled in pain, but it retaliated, swinging its massive tail toward Tarkus. The blow hit hard, sending Tarkus spinning through space. But the creature didn't give up. It pushed itself back to its feet, its glowing eyes locked on the enemy. The Salcor Marvok charged again, this time aiming for Tarkus's throat. But Tarkus was faster. With a swift move, it dodged the attack and leaped onto the Salcor creature's back. Its claws sank deep into the Marvok's flesh, and with a mighty roar, Tarkus tore through the enemy's spine. The Xalcor Marvok let out a final scream before collapsing, its massive body drifting lifelessly in space. Tarkus stood victorious, its chest heaving with the effort. The battle wasn't over, but this fight was won. "We did it," Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe. But the fight was far from over. The Xalcor flagship remained a threat, its weapons still firing on the Eureka and its remaining ships. Tarkus turned, its eyes locking onto the flagship as it charged forward, leaving the wreckage of the Xalcor Marvok behind. "Captain," Clara said, her voice tense. "Tarkus is going after the flagship. We need to make sure it doesn't go down alone." Elena nodded, determination in her eyes. "We're with it. Get us in range to help." The Eureka moved in, its weapons firing once again. The enemy flagship returned fire, but Tarkus was faster. It leaped onto the side of the flagship, its claws digging into the hull as it began to rip through the metal. The Xalcor crew on board fired at the creature, but Tarkus didn't flinch. It was on a mission now, not just to survive, but to protect the people who had given it a second chance. "Tarkus, you're not alone," Clara said, watching from the comms. "We're right behind you." The Eureka's weapons continued to fire, hitting key parts of the flagship and weakening its shields. The Xalcor ship was slowing down, its power starting to fail. "Captain," Clara said, her voice filled with urgency. "We've done it. The flagship's shields are failing. We've got one last shot." Elena took a deep breath, her eyes focused on the target. "Fire everything we've got. Let's end this." The Eureka unleashed everything in its arsenal. Energy blasts, missiles, and laser fire all tore through the Xalcor flagship. The massive ship shook, its hull starting to crack under the pressure. Tarkus held on, its claws embedded deep in the flagship's side, refusing to let go. With one final roar, Tarkus tore through the flagship's central core, sending a shockwave that ripped the ship apart. The Eureka and its crew watched as the massive vessel exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The battle was over. The Xalcor fleet, without its flagship and its ultimate weapon, scattered into retreat. Tarkus floated in space, breathing heavily, its body battered but victorious. The creature had faced its past, overcome its enemies, and now it was free. Elena allowed herself a small smile. They had done it. Tarkus had done it. The humans and the Marvok were no longer enemies. They were allies, bound by something stronger than survival. They had fought for each other, and together they had won. "Thank you, Tarkus," Elena whispered into the quiet of space. Tarkus's glowing eyes met hers from the distance. It didn't need words to understand. It had found its place. It had found a family.